Picture a dragonfly. Now imagine one with a wingspan wider than a golden eagle's, swooping through a steaming jungle canopy, so thick that sunlight barely reaches the forest floor. Imagine a millipede longer than you are tall, crawling across rotting vegetation that has been piling up for thousands of years because nothing on the entire planet can break it down. And imagine a scorpion the size of a Labrador retriever, stalking through shallow swamp water with pincers that could clamp down on small reptiles. This was Earth, 300 million years ago, and every single one of those creatures was real. The Carboniferous period is one of the strangest chapters in our planet's history, a time when the air itself was different, when the forests were so vast and so efficient at producing oxygen that insects grew to sizes that seem physically impossible today. A time before the dinosaurs, before the mammals, before birds ever took to the sky. The land belonged to bugs, and they didn't waste the opportunity. So what turned Earth into a breeding ground for giant arthropods? And why did they all disappear? The answer starts with the planet itself, because nothing about Carboniferous Earth would feel familiar to you. The Carboniferous period lasted from roughly 359 million years ago to 299 million years ago, a span of about 60 million years. The name itself comes from the Latin word carbo, meaning coal, and that name exists for a very specific reason that connects this ancient world directly to your daily life. More on that later. During this period, Earth's continents were in the process of colliding and merging into a single massive landmass that would eventually become the supercontinent Pangaea. The climate was warm, the air was humid, and across the equatorial regions of what we now call Europe and North America, enormous swamp forests stretched for thousands of kilometers in every direction. These weren't forests the way you picture them. There were no oak trees, no pines, no maples. None of those plants existed yet. The dominant trees were lycopsids, a type of giant club moss that could grow up to 40 meters tall, roughly the height of a 13-story building. Picture a tree trunk covered in diamond-shaped leaf scars, with no branches until the very top, rising out of shallow brown water, like a column built by some alien architect. Below the canopy, massive ferns and horsetails stood as tall as modern 2-story houses, their fronds so dense that the air underneath barely moved. And everything was wet, not just damp, wet. The ground was permanently waterlogged, a murky, shallow swamp stretching out in every direction. The air was thick enough to taste, saturated with moisture and the heavy smell of rotting vegetation. Temperatures at the equator stayed hot year-round, probably above 30 degrees Celsius, and the humidity never broke. If you stepped into a carboniferous forest, the heat alone would hit you before anything else did. Fallen trees didn't rot in this environment. They just sank into the muck and stayed there. And that detail, the part about trees not decomposing, is arguably the single most important fact about this entire era because it explains almost everything that happened next. During the Carboniferous, the bacteria and fungi that decompose wood today hadn't fully evolved yet. Specifically, they hadn't figured out how to break down lignin, the tough organic compound that gives wood its rigidity and structure. Lignin is the reason the tree can stand upright rather than flopping over like a blade of grass. It is one of the most complex organic molecules in nature, and during the Carboniferous, nothing on Earth could digest it. So when these enormous lycopsid trees died and toppled into the swamp, they didn't decay. They were buried under layers of sediment and stagnant water, locked away from the atmosphere, their carbon trapped underground in vast layers of compressed organic matter. Millions of trees over millions of years, piling up in a planet-wide graveyard that nothing could clean up. This had two enormous consequences that reshaped the entire planet. First, all that trapped carbon meant less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The forests were pulling CO2 out of the air through photosynthesis, converting it into wood and leaves and bark. Normally, when a tree dies and decomposes, that carbon goes back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. But with nothing breaking down the lignin, the carbon stayed buried. The planet was essentially running a one-way carbon pump, and it had been operating for tens of millions of years with no off switch. Second, and this is the part that created the monsters. With so much carbon dioxide being removed and so much oxygen being produced by these vast photosynthesizing forests, atmospheric oxygen levels climbed to staggering heights. Today, oxygen makes up about 21% of the air you breathe. During the peak of the Carboniferous, that number reached 35%, nearly 50% more oxygen in every single breath than you experience right now. And that oxygen surplus changed the rules for every living thing on the planet, especially the insects. Now, here's where it gets unsettling. Insects don't breathe the way you and I do. They don't have lungs. They don't have a bloodstream that carries oxygen to their muscles and organs the way mammals do. Instead, they use a network of tiny tubes called tracheae that run throughout their bodies, pulling oxygen directly from the surrounding air into their tissues through simple diffusion. This system works perfectly well at small sizes. A housefly, a beetle, a grasshopper, they all get enough oxygen through their tracheae to function without any problems. But the system has a hard ceiling. The bigger an insect gets, the longer those tubes have to be, and the harder it becomes to deliver oxygen deep into the core of its body. At some point, the tubes literally can't keep up with the body's oxygen demand, and the insect simply cannot grow any larger, unless the air itself is richer in oxygen. Pump the atmosphere up to 35% oxygen, and suddenly those tracheae can deliver oxygen much further, much faster. The diffusion gradient steepens, the tubes become more efficient, and the size ceiling lifts dramatically. But oxygen alone doesn't fully explain what happened. There's a second factor that scientists believe played a major role in Carboniferous gigantism: competition, or rather, the complete lack of it. During the Carboniferous, there were no birds, no bats, no flying vertebrates of any kind. The skies were an open playing field with no incumbent predators. On the ground, the largest vertebrates were amphibians that stayed near the water. Huge swaths of ecological space were simply empty, waiting for something to fill them. When you combine oxygen-rich air with wide-open ecological niches and zero competition from above, you get the conditions for something extreme. And nature responded exactly the way you'd expect. Things got extreme. The most famous resident of the Carboniferous skies was Meganeura monyi, a predatory insect that looked like a dragonfly built for war. Technically, Meganeura wasn't a true dragonfly. It belonged to a related but now extinct group called griffinflies. But the resemblance is close enough that you'd recognize it immediately, just at a scale that would stop you in your tracks. Meganeura monyi had a wingspan of up to 75 centimeters. That is 2.5 feet from wingtip to wingtip, roughly the same wingspan as a pigeon or even a small hawk. When researchers first measured the fossil proportions, the comparison to modern birds of prey wasn't just metaphorical. Meganeura was built like an aerial hunter, with a long, streamlined body and wings designed for fast, agile flight through dense forest canopy. The first Meganeura fossil was discovered in 1880, buried among coal deposits near Coventry, France. A paleontologist named Charles Brongniart formally described it 5 years later, and it immediately captured the scientific imagination. Brongniart would return to the Coventry coal sites repeatedly throughout his career, and these sites kept producing new and remarkable insect fossils from the late Carboniferous, building a picture of an aerial ecosystem unlike anything the modern world has ever seen. Fossil evidence of Meganeura and its close relatives reveals spiked legs designed for snatching prey mid-flight, along with heavy-duty mandibles lined with sharp cutting edges for crushing and slicing through the exoskeletons of smaller insects. Studies of the closely related Meganeurites gracilipes show that these mandibles were formidable weapons, not the delicate mouthparts of a modern damselfly, but robust, armor-cracking tools built for an active predator that caught and killed on the wing. Scientists believe Meganeura fed on other flying insects and possibly on small amphibians that it could grab from branches or the surface of the swamp water. Imagine a hunting strategy similar to a modern peregrine falcon, diving at speed through the forest canopy, locking onto prey with those spiked legs, and crushing it mid-air before landing on a branch to feed. Except there was no falcon. There was no bird of any kind. Meganeura filled that role entirely. What made its dominance even more complete was the total absence of competition. There were no birds during the Carboniferous, not a single one. Birds wouldn't evolve for another 150 million years. Reptiles existed, but they were small, ground-dwelling creatures that posed no threat to anything in the air. Meganeura had the skies entirely to itself. There was nothing above it in the food chain and nothing competing with it for territory, just unlimited hunting grounds across a canopy that stretched from horizon to horizon, filled with prey that had absolutely no defense against an attack from above. That kind of ecological dominance is rare in the history of life. Meganeura held onto it for millions of years, unchallenged and unchecked, the apex predator of an empire made of air. Now, the skies were terrifying, but the forest floor was worse. Arthropleura armata holds a record that has never been broken and almost certainly never will be. It was the largest land-based invertebrate that has ever existed on Earth. Nothing before it, nothing after it, and nothing alive today comes anywhere close. This creature was a relative of modern millipedes, though calling it a millipede feels like calling a great white shark a fish. Technically accurate, but it completely misses the scale. Arthropleura could reach 2.5 meters in length. That's over 8 feet and half a meter in width, roughly 1.5 feet across. To put that in perspective, this creature was longer than a king-size bed and wider than most doorways. An armored, segmented animal that could fill a hallway, scuttling through the undergrowth of a swamp forest. Fossils of Arthropleura have been found near modern-day Scotland and across North America, along with extensive trackways preserved in sandstone that show this animal moved quickly across the forest floor. The tracks are wide, evenly spaced, and suggest a creature that was not sluggish or slow. Paleontologists studying these trackways have estimated that Arthropleura could cover ground at a pace that would be deeply uncomfortable to witness. You would not want to see one of these coming toward you through the undergrowth, regardless of what it ate. And here's the twist that catches everyone off guard. Arthropleura wasn't a predator. For years, scientists assumed something that massive had to be carnivorous. Those armored body segments, that intimidating size, it all pointed toward an apex predator of the forest floor. But the fossil evidence tells a completely different story. Despite the dozens of Arthropleura specimens that have been discovered across multiple continents, not a single one has been found with preserved mouthparts. Not one. Whatever mouth Arthropleura had, it wasn't built to last in the fossil record, which strongly suggests it wasn't the kind of heavy-duty crushing apparatus you'd expect from a meat-eater. And the gut contents that have been analyzed tell the rest of the story. They contained plant matter, fern spores, fragments of lycopsid bark, bits of decomposing vegetation from the swamp floor. This 8-foot creature was a vegetarian. It spent its days crawling through the Carboniferous swamp forest, processing decaying plant material like a massive armored recycling machine, which, in a strange way, makes the whole picture even more unsettling. Because if the herbivore was 8 feet long, what size were the actual predators? One answer to that question lived in what is now Scotland. Pulmonoscorpius kirktanensis was a scorpion, a real venomous, pincer-wielding scorpion built on a scale that would give anyone nightmares. This creature measured nearly a meter from the tips of its claws to the end of its tail stinger, about 3 feet long. For comparison, the largest scorpions alive today, species like the emperor scorpion, barely crack 8 inches. Pulmonoscorpius was almost 5 times that size, close to the dimensions of a house cat. Now imagine a house cat with armor plating, a venomous stinger on a flexible tail, and claws designed to hold struggling prey in place while it delivered the killing strike. Every known fossil of Pulmonoscorpius has come from a single location, East Kirkton Quarry, roughly 20 miles west of Edinburgh. And the geographic detail that makes this even more surreal is that during the early Carboniferous, around 330 million years ago, Scotland was not in the North Atlantic. It sat squarely on the equator, covered by dense tropical swamp forest in a warm, humid climate that would have felt more like modern-day Brazil than the Scottish Highlands. The rolling green hills and cold rain that define Scotland today existed nowhere in the Carboniferous version. It was a tropical jungle, and Pulmonoscorpius was one of its top predators. Scientists believe this giant scorpion hunted other arthropods, small amphibians, and possibly the earliest reptiles. Its hunting strategy would have been familiar to anyone who has watched a modern scorpion on a nature documentary. Grab the prey with the front pincers, hold it steady, curve the segmented tail forward over the body, and drive the venomous stinger home. Same method scorpions have been using for hundreds of millions of years, just scaled up to proportions that would clear a room. And Pulmonoscorpius wasn't alone in the undergrowth. Not even close. The Carboniferous was saturated with oversized arthropods at every level of the ecosystem. Mazathyros enormis was a flying insect that took the concept of wings to an extreme. This creature had 6 wings, not 4, including a smaller pair of winglets mounted in front of its main flight surfaces. Its total wingspan reached about 56 centimeters, nearly 2 feet across, and it belonged to a now extinct group called paleodictopennins. These insects had beak-like mouthparts that they used to pierce plant stems and feed on sap, and some species of paleodictyopterans grew large enough to serve as prey for Meganeura and its relatives. Predators hunting herbivores. A fully functioning food web built almost entirely out of arthropods. Mazathyros lived around 309 million years ago in what is now Illinois, in the Mazon Creek fossil beds that have produced some of the most remarkable Carboniferous specimens ever found. Giant cockroaches scurried through the undergrowth, thriving in the wet, decaying vegetation that blanketed the forest floor. These were ancestors of the same cockroaches that live in your walls today, just significantly larger. They were already doing what cockroaches have always done: eating everything, surviving everything, and showing up in places where they weren't welcome. Massive mayflies filled the air above the swamp water, and for a long time, scientists thought giant spiders also called the Carboniferous home. A fossil creature called Megarachne cervini was originally described as a spider nearly 40 centimeters long, which would have made it the largest spider in Earth's history. But later analysis revealed that Megarachne was actually a eurypterid, a type of aquatic sea scorpion, not a spider at all. So if you were worried about giant Carboniferous spiders, you can relax. Slightly. The spiders were still around, just not nearly that big. Not yet. The sheer density of large arthropods during this period is hard to overstate. Every ecological niche that insects and their relatives could fill, they filled, and they filled it at a scale the modern world has never repeated. But the bugs weren't the only things growing large. The dominant vertebrates on land during the Carboniferous were amphibians, and some of them were genuine monsters in their own right. Eriops was a predatory amphibian that grew up to 2 meters long, with a broad, flat skull packed with teeth and a stocky body built for ambush hunting in shallow water. Think of a modern crocodile crossed with a giant salamander, and you're in the right neighborhood. Eriops would have lurked at the edges of swamp pools, half submerged in the murky water, waiting motionless for smaller creatures to wander within striking distance. Then a lunge, a snap of those jaws, and whatever had been standing at the water's edge wasn't standing anymore. Protorogerinus was even more formidable. This predatory amphibian reached nearly 6 meters in length, armed with rows of sharp teeth and a muscular, streamlined body that could move through water with alarming speed. Protorogerinus was one of the undisputed apex predators of the Carboniferous waterways, and its fossils paint a picture of an animal built for violent, efficient kills. If you fell into a Carboniferous swamp pool, the giant insects overhead would suddenly become the least of your worries. These amphibians dominated the vertebrate world for millions of years. They were tied to the water for reproduction, since their eggs needed a moist environment to survive. But the Carboniferous provided that in abundance. The entire planet, at least in the equatorial regions, was one enormous interconnected swamp. The amphibians had everything they needed, and nothing on land could challenge them. If you're finding this fascinating, hit subscribe. This channel covers the strangest chapters of Earth's history every week, and there's a lot more to come. Now, there was another group of animals living quietly in the Carboniferous underbrush. Small, lizard-like creatures that nobody at the time would have looked at twice. They were overshadowed by the giant amphibians, dwarfed by the massive arthropods, and completely unremarkable in every visible way. These were the first reptiles, and they were about to become the most consequential evolutionary development of the entire era. Hylonomus is one of the earliest known reptiles, discovered inside fossilized tree stumps in Joggins, Nova Scotia. Picture a hollow lycopsid stump that had been standing dead in a swamp for years. Small animals would crawl inside for shelter, and when the stump eventually filled with sediment and was buried, whatever was inside got preserved in stone. Hylonomus was tiny, only about 20 centimeters long, and it ate small insects. Compared to Arthropleura or Eriops, it was practically invisible. But Hylonomus and its relatives carried one adaptation that would eventually reshape every ecosystem on the planet. They laid amniotic eggs. Understanding why this matters requires understanding what amphibian reproduction actually looks like. Amphibian eggs are essentially soft, gelatinous masses with no protective shell, no internal water supply, and no defense against drying out. They have to stay moist at all times or the embryos inside will die within hours. This means amphibians are permanently chained to the water for reproduction. They can live on land, hunt on land, grow to enormous sizes on land. But when it comes time to breed, they have to return to ponds, streams, or swamps. Every single time, the amniotic egg broke that chain entirely. These eggs had a tough, protective shell and internal membranes that kept the embryo hydrated, nourished, and shielded from the outside environment. Reptiles could lay their eggs in dry soil, on hillsides, in burrows, under rocks, anywhere on land. Swamps, standing water, none of it was required anymore. They were free from the aquatic world in a way that no vertebrate on Earth had ever been before. During the Carboniferous, this advantage barely mattered. The world was wet enough for everyone. The swamps were everywhere. The humidity was constant, and the amphibians had no reason to worry about finding water. The reptiles were just another small group of animals scratching out a living in the undergrowth, eating insects and staying out of the way of the larger predators. But they were quietly building a biological toolkit that would make them the dominant land animals on the planet once conditions shifted, and conditions were about to shift in ways that nothing could survive unchanged. Around 305 million years ago, something started going wrong in the Carboniferous world. The coal forests that had dominated the equatorial regions for tens of millions of years began to collapse, not suddenly, not overnight, but steadily and irreversibly over a span of geological time, and they took the world of giant insects down with them. This event is called the Carboniferous Rainforest Collapse, and it stands as one of the most significant ecological disasters in the history of life on land. Multiple factors combined at once to destroy the swamp forests. The continents were still in the process of merging into Pangaea, and as these massive land masses came together, they disrupted the ocean currents that had been circulating warm water across the globe for millions of years. Ocean circulation patterns that had maintained the tropical climate were suddenly blocked or redirected by the collision of continents. This wasn't a gradual shift, it was a fundamental reorganization of how the planet's oceans moved heat around. Global temperatures started to drop. Ice sheets formed across the southern landmass of Gondwana, locking away water and dropping sea levels. The climate shifted from warm and constantly humid to cool and seasonal, with distinct wet and dry periods replacing the steady moisture that the swamp forests required to survive. The lycopsid forests couldn't handle the change. These trees were specialists, perfectly adapted to life in waterlogged swamps and completely unable to cope with drier conditions. Their root systems needed standing water. Their reproduction relied on spore dispersal through humid air. When the water retreated and the dry seasons arrived, the lycopsids had nowhere to go and no way to adapt quickly enough. Across vast stretches of the equatorial regions, the towering club moss forests died off and gave way to fern prairies and early conifer woodlands. These replacement plants were tougher, more drought-resistant, but they were nothing like the massive swamp forests that had come before. The dense, multi-layered canopy that had defined the Carboniferous landscape was replaced by something much more open, much more dry, and much less hospitable to the creatures that had evolved inside it. As the forests fragmented into isolated patches separated by drier terrain, the habitats of everything that lived in them fragmented too. Populations of giant arthropods that had once ranged across connected forest, covering entire continents, were suddenly trapped in ecological islands, cut off from each other by terrain they couldn't cross. Genetic diversity dropped, populations shrank, and the oxygen was dropping right along with them. Fewer forests meant less photosynthesis, which meant less oxygen being pumped into the atmosphere. The 35% oxygen levels that had enabled arthropod gigantism began their slow, steady decline toward modern levels. And as the oxygen thinned, the tracheal breathing system that had been these creatures' greatest advantage became their greatest vulnerability. Bodies that had evolved to operate in oxygen-rich air found themselves slowly starving for breath in a thinner atmosphere. The giants were being suffocated by the very air around them. Arthropleura was among the first to go. The fossil record suggests the 8-foot millipede went extinct around 303 million years ago, as the swamp forests it depended on dried up and broke apart. Without the continuous canopy of decaying plant matter that it fed on, and without the oxygen levels that sustained its massive body, Arthropleura simply couldn't survive the New World. Meganeura held on longer, with the last confirmed specimens disappearing around 299 million years ago at the very end of the Carboniferous period. Some related griffinflies persisted into the early Permian, including a creature called Meganeurasis, which may have been even larger than Meganeura, with some estimates putting its wingspan at over 70 centimeters. But Meganeuropsis and its relatives were living on borrowed time in a world that no longer supported their existence. By 283 million years ago, the last of the giant griffinflies was gone forever. Pulmonoscorpius and the other oversized scorpions had already been declining as their equatorial swamp habitats shrank and dried out. The giant cockroaches adapted better than almost anything else. Their descendants are still with us today, which should surprise absolutely nobody who's ever tried to get rid of one. But even the cockroaches became smaller as the atmospheric conditions that had supported outsized growth reversed. The amphibians took a devastating hit. Chained to the water for reproduction, they couldn't adapt quickly enough as the swamps dried out and their breeding grounds disappeared. Amphibian diversity crashed. Many lineages went extinct entirely, replaced in the fossil record by silence where once dominant species simply vanish from the stone. And the winners? Those small, overlooked reptiles with their tough shelled eggs. The amniotes didn't need swamps, constant humidity, or standing water to breed. When the world dried out, they were the only vertebrates with the biological toolkit to keep going. They expanded into upland habitats that the amphibians couldn't reach, colonized the drier interior regions of the merging continents, and radiated across the planet during the early Permian period. Among these early reptiles were the synapsids, a group that doesn't look like much in the Carboniferous fossil record but would eventually give rise to a lineage you know very well. Mammals, including, after another 250 million years of evolution, us. The age of giant insects ended not with a meteor strike or a volcanic catastrophe, but with a slow suffocation. The air thinned, the forests dried, and the creatures that had evolved to fill a world of excess oxygen could not adapt to a world of scarcity. There's one more piece of this story that ties the Carboniferous directly to the present day, and it's the reason this period has its name. Remember those trees that fell into swamps and never rotted? The lycopsids and giant ferns that were buried under millions of years of sediment because nothing on the planet could break down their lignin? Over immense stretches of geological time, the heat and pressure of Earth's crust compressed those ancient trees into something entirely different. Coal. The coal deposits that powered the Industrial Revolution, that heated homes across Europe for centuries, that still generate electricity in power plants around the world, came overwhelmingly from the Carboniferous period. The coal seams in Britain, in Appalachia, across Central Europe, across China, these are the compressed remains of those ancient swamp forests. The same forests where Meganeura hunted from the canopy, where Arthropleura crawled across the floor, and where Pulmonoscorpius stalked through the shallows. Every lump of Carboniferous coal is a fragment of that lost world, a piece of a tree that grew 300 million years ago, absorbed sunlight and carbon dioxide, died, fell into a swamp, and was buried before anything could eat it. When that coal is burned in a furnace or a power station, the energy released is literally stored sunlight from the age of giant insects. And there's a deeper irony running through all of this. By mining and burning that coal, we are releasing the same carbon that those Carboniferous trees spent millions of years locking away underground. The carbon dioxide that the forests removed from the ancient atmosphere is going right back in, warming the planet and shifting atmospheric chemistry in ways that, if they continue long enough, would push conditions back towards something the Carboniferous would recognize, though probably not the oxygen levels. The conditions that created 35% atmospheric oxygen were a one-time geological accident, the result of billions of tons of wood accumulating with nothing to decompose it. Once fungi and bacteria finally evolved the ability to break down lignin, that particular trick could never work again. Dead trees now rot. The carbon cycles back into the air, and the oxygen stays at 21%, which means the giant insects of the Carboniferous were products of a window that opened once in Earth's history and closed forever. They existed because the planet's chemistry briefly allowed something extraordinary, and they vanished the moment that chemistry changed. The world those creatures inhabited is long gone. The oxygen levels they needed will almost certainly never return. The swamp forests that stretched across continents have been crushed into black rock buried under layers of sediment and stone. But every time you see a dragonfly hover over a pond on a summer afternoon, wings catching the light, you're looking at a distant echo of something much, much bigger. Something that once owned the sky when nothing else could fly. Something that lived in a world so alien, so extreme, that if you somehow dropped a modern human into the middle of a carboniferous forest, the sheer scale of what was crawling and flying and hunting around them in every direction would be enough to send them running for their lives. Except there was nowhere to run, because the swamp stretched to every horizon, in every direction, across every continent on the planet, and in the shadows between the ferns, something with far too many legs was already moving toward you. If you found this video fascinating, check out our video on what Earth looked like when it had zero ice. The creatures that lived during that particular period were just as strange, and in some ways, even more unsettling.